They called her the Ghost. Sometimes, to their faces, it was Nurse Sharma. But in the hushed corridors of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, in the sterile break rooms, and behind the closed doors of attending physicians' offices, she was the Ghost. For 3 years, Anya Sharma had drifted through the hospital's most demanding wing, the cardiothoracic unit, a silent figure in worn, pale blue scrubs. She did the menial tasks, stocking carts, cleaning instruments, fetching coffee, and endured the casual disdain of the surgical residents and the outright contempt of the man who ruled the floor, Dr. Alastair Finch. They didn't know that the slight, almost imperceptible limp in her right leg was the souvenir of a Black Hawk helicopter crash in the Hindu Kush Mountains. They didn't know the raspy, quiet quality of her voice was the permanent signature of a shrapnel wound to her throat, an injury she'd sustained while shielding a wounded soldier with her own body. They didn't expect that the hands they saw meticulously counting sterile gauze pads were the same hands that had performed a field thoracotomy with a Leatherman tool and a pair of hemostats under enemy fire. Anya Sharma wasn't just a scrub nurse who'd barely made it through a second-tier nursing program, as the hospital gossip suggested. Anya Sharma was a ghost, yes, but not because she was insignificant. She was the ghost of a life they couldn't possibly comprehend. A life of honor, sacrifice, and a level of medical expertise that would make their own celebrated careers look like a child's playtime. And soon, in the blinding light of Operating Room 3, they were all about to see that ghost come roaring back to life. The air in the cardiothoracic wing of St. Jude's was a carefully curated cocktail of antiseptic, floor polish, and low-grade anxiety. It hummed with the electronic symphony of a dozen different machines, the gentle beep of heart monitors, the rhythmic sigh of ventilators, the low thrum of the central HVAC system. It was an environment designed for precision, for control, for the godlike pronouncements of men like Dr. Alastair Finch. He strode down the main corridor like a conquering hero returning from a triumphant campaign. His silver-streaked dark hair was perfect. His custom-tailored white coat was so pristine it seemed to repel the very germs it was designed to protect against. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe watch, worth more than Anya's car, glinted under the harsh, fluorescent lights. He didn't walk. He made an entrance. A gaggle of residents and interns, his sycophants, trailed in his wake like pilot fish clinging to a great white shark. "Finch, did you see the quarterly numbers? Our mortality rates are the lowest in the state." Dr. Evans, a third-year resident with more ambition than talent, gushed. Finch didn't break stride. He waved a dismissive hand. "Of course they are, Evans. When you have the best, you get the best results. It's simple math." His eyes, a cold, piercing blue, scanned the hallway and landed on Anya as she pushed a supply cart. A smirk touched his lips. "Speaking of the best," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "make sure the ghost here has my coffee ready before the 7 a.m. brief. Black, 2 sugars. Even she should be able to manage that." Laughter, dutiful and thin, rippled through his entourage. Anya's face remained a blank mask. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. Her hands, however, tightened on the steel bar of the cart. The knuckles went white. Inside her mind, a memory flickered, not of a hospital, but of a dusty, wind-swept forward operating base. The smell of diesel and sand. The voice of a young Marine, his leg mangled, asking her if he was going to die. Her own voice, not a rasp then, but clear and steady, promising him he would not. She had kept that promise. Here, she kept her silence. It was a different kind of promise, a promise to herself to remain invisible. The price of peace. She pushed the cart toward the supply closet, the slight drag of her right foot, the only sound accompanying the squeak of the wheels. They saw a meek, perhaps slightly incompetent, nurse. A woman in her late 30s who looked perpetually tired, her light brown hair always pulled back in a severe, functional bun, her face devoid of makeup. They saw the faded scrubs, the cheap, comfortable shoes. They saw what they wanted to see, someone beneath them. They had no idea that the ghost was a decorated colonel from the Army's most elite surgical unit, the 28th Combat Support Hospital, attached to Joint Special Operations Command. They didn't know she had pioneered 3 different life-saving techniques for battlefield trauma, procedures now taught at Walter Reed and West Point. They didn't know she had voluntarily relinquished her commission, buried her uniform, and taken this menial job under a slightly altered name to escape the very ghosts that now gave her her nickname. The noise, the fame, the endless commendations, they were louder and more painful than any explosion. Here, in the quiet anonymity of being underestimated, she'd found a fragile truce with her past. A truce that Dr. Finch seemed determined to break, one condescending remark at a time. The accumulation of these small cruelties was like sand piling up on a scale, and the scale was beginning to tip. The day continued its slow, grinding pace. Anya performed her duties with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. She restocked the crash carts, her hands moving with an economy of motion that should have been a clue. She knew, without looking, the exact location of every ampule of epinephrine, every size of endotracheal tube. While the residents gossiped and checked their phones, she would run silent drills in her head. A code blue on this floor? What are the likely causes? Post-op cardiac tamponade? Pulmonary embolism? She'd map out the steps, the drug dosages, the precise sequence of interventions. It was a habit forged in places where the delay of a single second was the difference between a flag-draped coffin and a welcome-home parade. Here, it was just a way to pass the time, a mental exercise to keep the rust from settling on skills she prayed she would never need again. Later that afternoon, a new nurse, a young woman named Chloe with bright, earnest eyes, approached her nervously. "Excuse me, Nurse Sharma?" Anya turned, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Anya is fine." "Anya," Chloe repeated, a small smile touching her lips. I wanted to ask, I saw you reorganizing the pericardiocentesis tray. You added a spinal needle and a second 10 cubic centimeter syringe. That's not standard hospital protocol." Anya looked at the tray, then back at Chloe. The standard 16-gauge catheter can sometimes be too flexible if the pericardial sac is fibrotic, especially in repeat sternotomy patients. The spinal needle gives you a better feel, more control. The second syringe is for if the first one clogs with a clot. You can switch it without losing your position. Chloe stared, her mouth slightly agape. "I learned that in a fellowship lecture from a visiting military surgeon. They called it the Kandahar technique." Anya's gaze became distant for a fraction of a second. "It's just a common-sense modification," she said, her voice dropping back to its usual quiet rasp. "Protocol is a guideline, not a gospel. It's good that you're paying attention." She turned and walked away, leaving Chloe staring after her, a furrow of deep confusion on her brow. The young nurse had a feeling she had just scratched the surface of something deep and complex, a truth hidden in plain sight. She had no idea how right she was. The interaction was a small stone tossed into the placid water of Anya's anonymity, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. It was another small crack in the dam she had so carefully constructed around her former life. The humiliation, when it came, was as public and theatrical as Dr. Finch could make it. It happened during morning rounds, the high holy ceremony of the cardiothoracic department. Finch stood at the center of a semicircle of 24 staff members, holding a patient's chart. He was pontificating about a complex aortic valve replacement he'd performed the day before. He was in his element, the benevolent king dispensing wisdom to his court. "The key," he announced, tapping a gold pen on the chart for emphasis, "is confidence. You cannot hesitate. The moment you doubt your own hands is the moment you lose the patient. You must command the operating room. Every single person, from the anesthesiologist down to the scrub nurse," he said, his eyes flicking deliberately toward Anya, who stood at the back of the crowd, holding a tray of fresh dressings. "Everyone must be an extension of the surgeon's will." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "For example," he continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips, "yesterday I requested a 4-0 proline suture. Simple enough, one would think. But Nurse Sharma here," he pointed the pen directly at her, "seemed to have trouble locating it. A full 10 seconds were wasted. 10 seconds. He shook his head in mock disbelief. "In my OR, 10 seconds can be a lifetime. What was the issue, nurse? Did the little numbers confuse you?" The residents and some of the senior nurses snickered. Anya felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of shame and anger. The truth was, Finch had barked suture without specifying a type, and when she'd held up both the proline and the ethibond for him to choose, he had snatched the proline and berated her for not reading his mind. Now, he was twisting it into a story of her incompetence. She stood frozen, the heavy weight of 24 pairs of eyes on her. Her throat felt tight, the old scar tissue pulling. "I apologize, doctor," she rasped, the words tasting like ash. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Finch snapped, turning back to his audience, basking in their sycophantic admiration. "Competence. It's all that matters. You either have it, or you get out of the way." The crowd dispersed, leaving Anya standing alone in the hallway. The laughter still echoed in her ears. Chloe, the young nurse from the day before, approached her cautiously. "That was unfair," she whispered, her face etched with sympathy. "He does that all the time." Anya took a slow, deep breath, forcing the tremor in her hands to still. She looked at Chloe, her eyes dark with a weariness that went far beyond a long shift. "Some men build themselves up by tearing others down," she said, her voice low and even. "It's the only way they know how to feel tall." She adjusted the dressings on her tray and continued down the hall, her limp seeming more pronounced than usual. The incident was another brick laid on the wall of her resentment, but it was also a warning. The quiet life she had sought was becoming untenable. The pressure was building, a deep, tectonic friction between the woman she was pretending to be and the woman she truly was. The ground beneath her feet was becoming increasingly unstable, and she could feel the tremors of an impending earthquake. She spent the rest of the day in a state of coiled tension, the surgeon's mocking voice a repeating loop in her mind. You either have it, or you get out of the way. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. She, who had stood her ground in the blood and chaos of war, was being told to get out of the way by a man who treated surgery like a performance art. The injustice of it settled deep in her bones, a cold, heavy weight, waiting for a reason to move. The klaxon's shriek was what broke the afternoon lull. Not a standard code, but the high-pitched, frantic alarm for a mass casualty incident. Code triage. The sound sliced through the hospital's calm, instantly changing the air. It became charged, electric. Doctors and nurses began moving with purpose, their faces grim. Anya was in the middle of restocking a suture cart when the announcement came over the PA system, a strained voice trying to remain calm. Code triage, mass casualty incident, multi-vehicle pileup on the I-5 freeway. All available surgical staff to the emergency department, stat. Anya didn't hesitate. She didn't run. Her movements became fluid, economical. She slammed the cart drawer shut, spun on her heel, and began walking, a fast, purposeful stride that minimized her limp, toward the ED. The muscle memory was absolute, a deeply ingrained protocol from 100 other moments just like this, only with the smell of sand and cordite instead of antiseptic. As she moved, she saw Finch emerge from his office, already barking orders, his face a mask of performative urgency. Get OR 3 and 4 prepped. I want my A-team assembled. Anesthesia. Where's my lead anesthesiologist? Someone get me a full workup on the incoming traumas. I want to know what I'm walking into. He was shouting into his phone, already curating the narrative of his own heroism. He noticed Anya moving past him and scoffed. And someone keep the ghost out of the way. We need professionals, not cart pushers. Anya didn't even register the insult. Her mind was already in the hot zone. She was calculating, processing. Multi-vehicle pileup, high probability of blunt force trauma, penetrating trauma from debris, crush injuries. Expect tension pneumothoraces, cardiac tamponades, massive internal bleeding. She entered the chaotic swirl of the emergency department. It was a scene from a nightmare. Gurneys were everywhere, medics shouting vitals, the floor already slick with blood and saline. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, vomit, the metallic tang of fear. Then she saw him. He was being wheeled in on a special gurney, surrounded by a frantic team. A man in an expensive, shredded suit, his chest impaled by a long, jagged piece of rebar. A security detail in black suits was trying to push through the crowd, their faces pale and panicked. Anya heard a medic shout his name. Marcus Thorne, CEO of Thorne Industries. BP is 80/40 and falling. Diminished breath sounds on the left, muffled heart sounds. He's circling the drain. Thorne, the industrialist, the man whose company was practically rebuilding the city, a man whose life was measured in billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. His survival was not just a medical issue, it was an economic one. Every senior doctor in the ED converged on the gurney. The chaos intensified. Get him to OR3 now, someone screamed. We need to crack his chest. Dr. Finch arrived, pushing lesser doctors aside. He took one look at the rebar, at the blood-soaked shirt, at the frantic numbers on the portable monitor. A flicker of something, not confidence but fear, crossed his face for a split second before he masked it with his usual arrogance. Clear the way, he boomed. This is my patient. I will handle this personally. He began striding alongside the gurney, shouting orders. Get me a full cardiothoracic tray. I want a sternal saw ready to go. And get that nurse. He pointed a shaking finger at a nearby junior nurse. To page the head of vascular, I might need backup. Anya watched from the edge of the chaos. She saw what Finch, in his panic, did not. The rebar wasn't just in his chest. Its angle of entry was low, just below the xiphoid process, and angled sharply upward. It wasn't a simple impalement. Her mind, a finely tuned diagnostic engine, saw the horrifying truth. The rebar had likely pierced the diaphragm, traversed the pericardium, and was now embedded in the right ventricle of the heart. The muffled heart sounds weren't just from bleeding, they were from cardiac tamponade. But worse, the tip of the rebar was probably pressing against the posterior wall of the ventricle. Pulling it out in the wrong way, or even just jostling it, would tear the ventricle open, causing an exsanguination that would be impossible to control. Cracking the chest with a sternal saw would send vibrations through the rebar, potentially causing that fatal tear. It was a death sentence. They were about to kill Marcus Thorne on the operating table, and as they wheeled him past her, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror, Anya made a decision. Her promise of peace was broken. Her truce was over. The ghosts were no longer behind her. They were in front of her, demanding action. She slipped into the stream of people rushing the gurney to OR3, her face grim, her movements silent. The ghost was about to become a hunter. She was no longer getting out of the way. She was stepping in. The controlled chaos of Operating Room 3 was a theater of impending doom. The bright, shadowless lights glared down on the figure of Marcus Thorne, his body a canvas of medical intervention. Tubes snaked from his mouth, IV lines bristled from his arms, and the monstrous piece of rebar jutted from his chest like a grotesque monument. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was dangerously fast and shallow, tachycardic, hypotensive. He's on the edge, Anya thought, her mind cold and clear as she stood in her designated corner prepping instruments. Dr. Finch scrubbed in with a flourish, talking loudly to the anesthesiologist, Dr. Chen. Once he's under, I'm going to do a median sternotomy. We'll get the chest open, get on bypass, and then I'll extract the foreign body and repair the damage. Standard procedure. Dr. Chen, a meticulous and cautious man, looked worried. Alistair, the vibrations from the sternal saw. With the object being so close to the heart, it could be catastrophic. Nonsense, Finch scoffed, holding his hands up for a junior nurse to glove him. It's the only way to get adequate exposure. Don't question my methods, Chen. Just keep him alive until I can work my magic. Anya felt a cold dread creep up her spine. He was going to do it. He was going to kill him with the saw. She had to do something. As Finch approached the table, she stepped forward, holding out a specific instrument. Doctor, she said, her voice a low rasp. Perhaps a clamshell thoracotomy instead? It would give you wider access to the ventricles without vibrating the sternum. Finch stopped. He turned and stared at her, as if she were a piece of talking furniture. The entire room went silent. The only sound was the frantic beeping of the monitor. Did you just offer me a surgical opinion, nurse? He asked, his voice dripping with venomous disbelief. You? You think you can tell me how to perform my own surgery? He let out a short, incredulous laugh. Get back in your corner and hand me the betadine. Anya didn't move. She held her ground, the instrument still in her hand. Sir, the angle of entry suggests the object has penetrated the right ventricle. A sternal saw will cause a fatal avulsion. You need to control the heart before you even think about extraction. The color drained from Finch's face, replaced by a flush of pure rage. For her to not only question him, but to do so with such specific, damning accuracy was an unforgivable sin. He saw the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the other staff. His authority was being challenged. That is the most ridiculous, insubordinate thing I have ever heard, he hissed. You are seconds away from being fired and thrown out of this hospital. Now, give me the betadine and shut your mouth. The heart monitor suddenly let out a long, piercing wail. V-tac! The patient was crashing. "He's going into ventricular tachycardia," Chen shouted. "I'm losing him." Finch panicked. His eyes darted from the monitor to the patient. "Paddles! Charge to 200!" he screamed. "No!" The word wasn't a rasp. It was a command. It shot from Anya's throat, sharp and clear, cutting through the panic. It was a voice no one in that room had ever heard before. It was the voice of a commander in the field. Everyone froze, including Finch. "Charging the paddles will make the heart seize," Anya said, her voice dropping to a steely calm as she moved to the table. "The contraction could impale the posterior wall. You'll kill him." She looked directly at Dr. Chen. "Push 150 of amiodarone. Now." Chen, wide-eyed, hesitated for only a second before nodding and drawing up the drug. He'd heard more authority in Anya's 2 words than in Finch's entire tirade. Finch finally snapped. The sight of his team obeying this lowly nurse pushed him over the edge. He lunged forward and physically shoved her. "Get away from my patient!" he roared. Anya stumbled back, her bad leg giving way. She caught herself on an instrument tray, the metal clattering loudly. The shove, the final insult, the breaking of the last thread of her restraint. She didn't get angry. She didn't shout. She straightened up slowly, and the air in the room seemed to change, to become heavy and cold. The tired, meek nurse was gone. In her place stood something else, something formidable. Her eyes, no longer downcast, were chips of ice. They locked onto Finch's. "You're right," she said, her voice now a low, terrifyingly calm contralto. "He's not your patient anymore." She turned to the stunned surgical team. "Listen to me," she commanded, and they did. They were mesmerized. "I need a Lebscher knife and a tufia rib spreader. We are doing a bilateral anterior thoracotomy." "Chloe," she said, her eyes finding the young nurse who was pale with shock. "You're my scrub. Get me a full cardiac set, heavy on the aortic clamps and pleated sutures. 3-0 silk ties. Stat." Chloe, jolted into action by the sheer force of Anya's will, nodded dumbly and began moving. "What do you think you're doing?" Finch screeched, his voice shrill. "This is my OR. I am the chief of surgery. Security, get this woman out of here." Anya ignored him. She stripped off her outer scrub top, revealing the tight-fitting undershirt beneath. The movement was fluid, athletic. She grabbed a scalpel from the tray. "Dr. Chen," she said, not taking her eyes off the patient's chest, "keep him as stable as you can. I'm going in." Before anyone could react, she made the first incision. A long, clean cut across the patient's chest, just below the pectoral muscles. The movement was impossibly fast, impossibly precise. It wasn't the hesitant motion of a nurse. It was the confident, brutal efficiency of a master trauma surgeon. The room watched, breathless. The ghost had been banished. The Valkyrie had arrived. The operating room, once Dr. Finch's kingdom, had become Anya's battlefield. The transformation was absolute. Her previous, hesitant and quiet demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an aura of intense, focused energy that radiated from her in palpable waves. Her hands, which Finch had once mocked for being slow, moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. They didn't seem like human hands. They were extensions of a will forged in the crucible of life and death urgency. "Lebscher knife," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. Chloe, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, slapped the heavy, chisel-like instrument into Anya's waiting palm. With a single, powerful motion, Anya split the patient's sternum. The sound, a wet, brutal crack, echoed in the dead silent room. It was a sound of violation, but under her control, it felt like an act of salvation. Rib spreader. The tuffia was placed. She cranked it open, exposing the thoracic cavity. The sight was horrific. The pericardial sac, the membrane around the heart, was swollen and bruised a deep, angry purple. It was filled with blood, squeezing the life out of the heart muscle. Cardiac tamponade, just as she'd predicted. Suction, she ordered. A resident, who minutes before had been laughing at Finch's jokes, numbly passed her the suction tube. Anya deftly made a small incision in the pericardium, and a gush of dark venous blood filled the tube. The heart, now visible, was struggling, spasming. And there it was, the rebar. It had pierced the lower section of the right ventricle, the tip tenting the posterior wall, exactly as she'd feared. A millimeter of movement in any direction would mean instant death. "He's stabilizing," Dr. Chen announced from the head of the bed, his voice filled with disbelief. "BP is coming up to 90/60. The amiodarone is working. The V-tach broke." Finch, who had been frozen in sputtering rage, finally found his voice. "This is insane. You're butchering him. You have no right. I'll have your license. I'll have you arrested for assault." He started to move toward the table again, his face a mask of apoplectic fury.
Anya didn't even look at him.
"Someone get him out of my OR," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as the scalpel in her hand. Two of the larger male residents, who had always vied for Finch's approval, exchanged a look. Then, in a stunning act of mutiny, they moved to block Finch's path. "Doctor," one of them said, his voice shaking slightly, "maybe you should just wait outside." The betrayal in Finch's eyes was absolute. He stared at his former disciples, now guarding the woman he despised. He was losing control. He was becoming irrelevant in his own operating room. "You're all fired!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Do you hear me? Fired!" No one paid him any attention. All eyes were on Anya. "I need Rumel tourniquets and umbilical tape," she said calmly. "We're going to isolate the vena cava. We can't put him on bypass. The heparin will cause him to bleed out from a dozen other internal injuries we haven't found yet. We're going to do this off-pump." A wave of gasps went through the room. An off-pump repair of a ventricular rupture with an impaled object was a procedure of legendary difficulty. It was something you read about in textbooks, a once-in-a-career case that most surgeons would never even attempt. "That's impossible," a resident whispered. "No," Anya replied without looking up from her work. "It's just difficult." For the next 20 minutes, she worked in a bubble of pure concentration. Her dialogue was a staccato burst of commands. "Plegited 4-0 proline. Right angle clamp. DeBakey forceps. More suction." The team around her, once Finch's acolytes, became a seamless extension of her will. They anticipated her needs, their movements becoming more efficient, more focused, inspired by the impossible display of skill they were witnessing. Chloe, the young nurse, was a revelation. She kept pace with Anya, her hands never fumbling, her eyes locked on the surgical field, slapping instruments into Anya's hand with perfect timing. Anya placed heavy silk sutures around the superior and inferior vena cava, passing them through the Rumel tourniquets. "Okay, Chen," she said, "on my mark, I'm going to occlude the inflow to the heart. We'll have about 90 seconds of total circulatory arrest. That's our window. Chloe, I want 4 plegited sutures loaded and ready. 4. "Ready," Chloe confirmed, her voice steady. Anya took a deep breath. "Okay, occluding. Now. She tightened the tourniquets. The massive veins leading to the heart flattened. The heart itself, starved of blood, seemed to shudder and shrink. The beeping of the monitor flatlined into a single, terrifying tone. Total circulatory arrest. The countdown had begun. Suture, Anya commanded. Her fingers flew. In, out, not. In, out, not. She was placing sutures around the entry wound of the rebar, reinforcing the fragile, torn muscle of the ventricle. Her movements were a blur. 30 seconds, Chen announced, his voice tight with tension. Next suture. In, out, not. She wasn't just stitching, she was rebuilding the wall of the heart itself. 60 seconds. Finch watched from the corner, his face ashen, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was witnessing something beyond his comprehension. This wasn't surgery as he knew it. This was something else, something primal and perfect. It was everything he pretended to be, made real in the hands of the woman he had tried to destroy. 80 seconds. Anya, you have to release. Chen's voice was strained. One more, Anya gritted out. She placed the final reinforcing stitch. Okay. Chloe grabbed the rebar. Firmly. Do not move it. On my mark, I'm going to release the tourniquets, and you are going to pull it out in one smooth motion. Straight back. Do you understand? Yes, Chloe whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold, bloody steel. Releasing inflow. Now. Anya loosened the tourniquets. Blood surged back into the heart. It swelled, and for a horrifying second, it lay still. Then, it gave a single, powerful beat. And another. The monitor exploded back to life with a steady, strong rhythm. Pull! Anya commanded. Chloe pulled. The rebar slid out with a sickening wet sound. A torrent of blood erupted from the wound. But Anya was ready. She pressed a finger over the hole, and with her other hand, she pulled the pre-placed sutures tight. Tie! 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 The resident next to her tied the knots with trembling fingers. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The sutures held. The wall of the heart was intact. Anya held her position for a long moment, watching the monitor, watching the beautifully, miraculously beating heart. The rhythm was steady, the pressure was stable. She had done it. She took a step back from the table, her body slick with sweat. She looked at the stunned faces around her. Then her eyes fell on Dr. Finch, who was slumped against the wall, his mouth hanging open, his expensive suit jacket stained with someone else's blood. He looked broken. Close him up, Anya said, her voice once again quiet, but now carrying the immense weight of her actions. Use wire for the sternum, and for God's sake be gentle. She turned and walked toward the scrub sink, her movements slow, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-aching weariness in its place. The room remained silent for a long time, the only sound, the steady, life-affirming beep of the heart monitor. The doors to the operating theater swished open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. It wasn't a nurse or a resident. It was a man who carried with him an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority that made Dr. Finch's manufactured arrogance look like a child's tantrum. He was tall and ramrod straight, in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. He wore a simple, perfectly pressed dark suit, but he moved with the unmistakable economy of a career military officer. Flanking him were two more men in suits, and the visibly terrified hospital administrator, a man named Henderson. The man's eyes, a pale, piercing grey, swept the room. They took in the scene, the open chest of the patient, the discarded rebar in a steel pan, the blood-spattered floor, the stunned surgical team, and Dr. Finch, who was now trying to straighten his jacket and regain some semblance of dignity. The man's gaze bypassed them all, landing on the figure of Anya, who was leaning against the far wall, her head bowed, her hands braced against the cool tile. "Henderson," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant obedience. "Is that him? Is that Marcus Thorne?" "Yes, General Wallace," Henderson stammered, wringing his hands. "There was a complication, but it appears to be under control." General Wallace. The name hung in the air. Everyone knew who he was. General Thaddeus "Bulldog" Wallace, retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a living legend. He was also a close personal friend of Marcus Thorne, and more importantly, the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the entire St. Jude's Hospital network. Wallace ignored Henderson. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the operating room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He stopped, not at the head of the patient, but directly in front of Anya. The entire room held its breath. Dr. Finch, seeing an opportunity to reclaim his narrative, stepped forward. "General," he began, his voice slick with a desperate attempt at charm. "Alastair Finch, Chief of Surgery. It was a harrowing situation, but I managed to stabilize him. This nurse," he gestured dismissively at Anya, "interfered and, frankly, endangered the patient. But my team and I were able to overcome the—" "Quiet," Wallace said, without even looking at him. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. Finch flinched as if struck and fell silent, his mouth hanging open. Wallace's hard eyes softened as he looked at Anya. He reached out a hand, not to reprimand her, but to gently touch her shoulder. "Colonel," he said, his voice now filled with a warmth and respect that stunned everyone present. "I heard there was chaos in the OR. I should have known I'd find you in the middle of it." "Colonel." The word detonated in the room. The residents, the nurses, Dr. Chen, they all stared, their minds struggling to connect the title with the meek scrub nurse they called the Ghost. Anya looked up, and for the first time, a genuine, weary smile touched her lips. "General," she rasped, "you're a long way from Kandahar." "Not so far, it seems," Wallace replied, his eyes twinkling. He glanced at the patient on the table, the neatly sutured heart beating strongly in his open chest. He looked at the discarded rebar. He looked at the terrified faces of the staff. Then he looked back at Anya. "An off-pump ventricular repair on an impaled object. You always were one for showing off, Sharma." He turned to face the rest of the room. His face was granite once more. "For those of you who are confused," he said, his voice dropping back into its command register, "allow me to introduce you. This is not Nurse Sharma. This is Colonel Anya Sharma, United States Army retired. For 6 years, she was the chief trauma surgeon for the entire Joint Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts." He took a step toward the still-frozen Dr. Finch. "Colonel Sharma," he continued, his voice dripping with ice, "pioneered the very procedure you just witnessed, a procedure that has saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers, including my own son. She developed the Kandahar technique that Nurse Chloe mentioned earlier. She has performed more successful emergency thoracotomies in active war zones than any 10 civilian surgeons will perform in their entire careers. She is, without exaggeration, one of the finest trauma surgeons this country has ever produced. He was now standing inches from Finch, who looked like he was about to faint. "And you," Wallace hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "You shoved her. You called her a cart pusher. You ordered her out of the way." He leaned in closer. "You arrogant, incompetent fool. You weren't just about to kill Marcus Thorne. You were about to kill him in front of the one person on this continent who could have saved him." The general straightened up and looked at Henderson, the hospital administrator. "This man," he said, pointing a thumb at Finch, "is to be removed from this hospital. His credentials are to be suspended pending a full review by the board, a review which I will personally oversee. His malpractice insurance carrier will be notified by the end of the day. He will not practice medicine in this hospital or any other ever again if I have anything to say about it." He turned back to Finch, whose face had crumpled into a mask of disbelief and terror. "You wanted her out of the way, Doctor? Fine. Get out of my sight." The public humiliation was swift, brutal, and absolute. Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who had ruled the floor with an iron fist and a silver tongue, simply fell apart. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, blotchy grey. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The sheer totality of his ruin, delivered so calmly and irrevocably by a man of General Wallace's stature, was too much for his mind to process. "No," Finch finally whimpered, the sound small and pathetic in the vast, silent room. "You can't. I'm the chief of surgery. I have a reputation. The board loves me." He looked desperately at the faces of his former team, the residents and nurses he had alternately terrorized and charmed. He was searching for an ally, a friendly face, a flicker of support. He found nothing. All he saw was contempt, pity, and a cold, satisfying dose of righteous justice. The sycophants who had laughed at his jokes and scrambled for his approval now stared at him as if he were a stranger, their expressions ranging from shock to a grim, dawning satisfaction. "Your reputation," General Wallace stated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion, "was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide your own glaring incompetence. You bullied a war hero. You nearly killed my friend. Your reputation, as of this moment, is dust." Wallace turned to his two assistants. "Escort Dr. Finch from the premises. He is to collect his personal belongings from his office and nothing else. He is not to speak to any member of the staff. If he resists, call security and have him removed for trespassing." The two men in suits moved forward. They didn't touch Finch, but their presence was an undeniable physical threat. They flanked him, their bodies creating an invisible cage. "This way, Doctor," one of them said, his voice polite but unyielding. Finch's composure finally shattered completely. The mask of the confident, handsome surgeon dissolved, revealing the sniveling, terrified man beneath. "No, please," he cried, his voice escalating into a shrill plea. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" He looked wildly at Anya, his eyes swimming with tears of self-pity. "Please, tell him. It was a misunderstanding. I was under pressure." Anya looked at him, her expression unreadable. She thought of the 3 years of casual cruelty, the public humiliations, the endless stream of petty insults. She thought of him shoving her, of him roaring for her to be fired while a man's life hung in the balance. She offered him no comfort, no absolution. She simply held his gaze, her silence more damning than any accusation. In her eyes, he saw the full measure of his failure. He stumbled backward, away from her gaze, as if it were a physical force. "I have connections," he babbled, looking at Henderson. "I bring this hospital millions in grant money. You can't just throw me out." Henderson, who had once fawned over Finch, now looked at him with cold disdain. The administrator's survival instincts had kicked in. "Your grants are tied to your position, Alistair," he said coldly, "a position you no longer hold. The General is the chairman of the board. His word is final. Now please, go with these gentlemen and avoid making this any more difficult than it already is." The finality in Henderson's voice was the last straw. A choked sob escaped Finch's lips. The two men took his arms, their grips firm but not rough. They began to lead him toward the door, a fallen king being frog-marched out of his own throne room. As he passed the surgical team, he saw Chloe, the young nurse, looking at him. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only a quiet, steely resolve. He had been judged and found wanting by the very people he had considered beneath his notice. His final, pathetic plea was directed at the room at large. "My watch," he whimpered, looking at the Patek Philippe on his wrist as if it were a lifeline. "It's worth a fortune." No one responded. The symbol of his status, the object he had so often flaunted, was now just a useless, gaudy trinket on the wrist of a ruined man. The doors to the OR swished shut behind him, cutting off the sound of his weeping. An era of fear and arrogance at St. Jude's had come to a quiet, ignominious end. The room was left in a profound silence, the air feeling cleaner, lighter. The oppressive weight of Finch's ego had been lifted, and in its place, a sense of awe and profound respect settled over the remaining staff as they all turned to look at the woman who had made it happen. With Finch gone, the oppressive tension in the operating room finally broke, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent atmosphere. The surgical team, led by a senior resident, began the meticulous process of closing Marcus Thorne's chest cavity. Their movements were careful, imbued with a new sense of gravity. They weren't just closing a wound, they were sealing a miracle. The steady, strong beep of the heart monitor was a constant, reassuring presence, a testament to the life that had been pulled back from the brink. General Wallace walked back over to Anya, his expression softening once more. "You're still full of surprises, Sharma," he said, his voice low. "Hiding out as a scrub nurse? I thought you were writing a book up in the mountains of Colorado." Anya leaned her head back against the cool wall, the exhaustion finally hitting her in a tidal wave. "The quiet didn't suit me, General," she rasped. "Too much time to think. I needed the noise, the work, just a different kind of work." "Well, you've certainly found it," Wallace said with a wry smile. He looked around the room, at the awe-struck faces of the doctors and nurses. "I think your time as the ghost is officially over." Dr. Chen, the anesthesiologist, approached them, pulling off his surgical cap. His face was pale, but his eyes shone with unadulterated admiration. He looked at Anya, seemingly at a loss for words. Colonel, ma'am," he stammered. "I've been an anesthesiologist for 20 years. I've worked with the best surgeons in the country. I have never, ever seen anything like what you just did. It was magnificent." Anya gave him a small, tired nod. "You kept him stable, Doctor. I couldn't have done it without you on his airway." The simple, direct praise seemed to mean more to Chen than any formal award. He beamed. Then Chloe, her task at the instrument table finished, came forward. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Colonel Sharma," she began, her voice thick with emotion. Anya, Anya corrected her gently. Anya, Chloe repeated. When you told me to grab the rebar, I was so scared. But when you looked at me, I knew I could do it. You trusted me. Anya reached out and put a hand on the young nurse's arm. You were steady, Chloe. You have good hands and a clear head. You're going to be a phenomenal nurse. Chloe's face crumpled, and she let out a small sob of relief and gratitude. In that moment, the torch of competence and compassion was passed from the hidden warrior to the next generation. Henderson, the administrator, bustled over, his face a mask of anxious solicitude. Colonel Sharma, on behalf of the entire hospital, I am so sorry for the unprofessional environment you've had to endure. Dr. Finch's behavior was an aberration, I assure you. We had no idea, of course. Is there anything at all we can do? General Wallace answered for her. You can start by creating a new position, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Director of Trauma and Emergency Surgical Response. You can give Colonel Sharma full authority to build her own team, set her own protocols, and equip her department with whatever she needs. You can give her Dr. Finch's salary, his office, and his parking space. That would be a start. Henderson blinked, then nodded enthusiastically. Yes, of course, General. Consider it done. Colonel Sharma, your wish is our command. Anya just shook her head slowly, a faint, weary smile on her face. The irony was overwhelming. An hour ago, she was being berated for not finding a suture fast enough. Now, she was being offered a kingdom. The world had tilted on its axis, all because she had finally stopped hiding. She looked over at the operating table, where the team was placing the final skin staples. Marcus Thorne's heart was beating strong and steady. That was the only validation she had ever needed. The rest, the titles, the office, the apologies, was just noise. But maybe, she thought, it was a noise she could finally learn to live with. The immediate crisis was over, the patient was saved, the villain was vanquished. But for Anya, the long, quiet war with herself was just entering a new and uncertain phase. Weeks turned into a month. The story of what happened in OR3 became the stuff of legend at St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. It was told and retold in hushed, reverent tones in the cafeteria, the locker rooms, and the on-call suites. The details became grander with each telling, but the core truth remained. The quiet, unassuming scrub nurse they called the Ghost was a hero, a hidden giant who had awakened to save a life and dismantle a tyrant. Dr. Alistair Finch was gone. His name was scrubbed from the hospital directory, his portrait removed from the gallery of department chiefs. He faced a litany of legal troubles, from a board review that uncovered years of fudged surgical reports to a massive malpractice lawsuit filed by Marcus Thorne's corporation. He was ruined, a ghost in his own right, haunting the periphery of a world that no longer wanted him. The sycophants who had once orbited him either found new patrons or learned a harsh lesson in loyalty and character. The entire culture of the cardiothoracic department began to change, becoming more collaborative, less toxic. Anya, true to General Wallace's decree, was now Dr. Sharma, the new director of the Center for Trauma and Emergency Medicine. She didn't take Finch's opulent office with its mahogany desk and city views. Instead, she chose a smaller, more functional space adjacent to the emergency department, a place closer to the action. She didn't wear a pristine white coat. She wore comfortable, dark grey scrubs, the same kind she'd always worn, but now they fit her with an air of authority. The limp was still there, a permanent reminder of her past, but she no longer tried to hide it. It was part of her, a piece of her story. She built her team not from the arrogant and the credentialed, but from the competent and the compassionate. She promoted Dr. Chen to be her deputy. She took Chloe under her wing, personally mentoring the young nurse, honing her sharp instincts and steady hands. She brought in other veterans, medics and corpsmen, whose skills were often overlooked by the civilian world. Her team was a motley crew of quiet professionals who valued results over reputation. They were efficient, dedicated, and fiercely loyal to the woman who saw their true worth. One rainy afternoon, Anya took the elevator up to the penthouse suite of the hospital's recovery wing. She knocked on the door. A voice, strong and clear, called out, "Come in." Marcus Thorne was sitting in a large armchair by the window, looking out at the rain-streaked city skyline. He was no longer pale and terrified, but robust and healthy, dressed in a silk robe. He turned as Anya entered, and a broad smile lit up his face. "Dr. Sharma," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "The woman I owe my life to." "You owe your life to a lot of good people, Mr. Thorne," Anya said, her voice its usual quiet tone, but the rasp was less pronounced now, softened by use and confidence. "Perhaps," Thorne said, gesturing to a chair opposite him. "But they tell me you were the one who held my heart in your hands. Literally." He paused, his expression turning serious. "The general told me your story, all of it, what you did over there, and what you did for me here. Thank you feels like an insultingly small phrase." "It's enough," Anya said. "Seeing you sitting here, breathing on your own, is enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain. "I'm making a donation to the hospital," Thorne said finally. "A large one. It's to fully fund your new trauma center. State-of-the-art equipment, a new dedicated wing, research grants, whatever you need. No strings attached." He looked at her, his eyes keen. "Build something that lasts, Doctor. Build something worthy of the people you save." Anya met his gaze and nodded slowly. "I will." Later that evening, after her shift, Anya walked through the now quiet hospital. She didn't go to the parking garage. Instead, she went to the small, rarely used chapel on the ground floor. It was empty. She sat in a back pew, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling the air. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was hiding. The ghosts of her past were still there, but they were no longer pursuing her. They walked beside her now, not as burdens, but as reminders of who she was, of the lives she had touched, and the promises she had kept. She was not the ghost. She was not Colonel Sharma. She was just Anya, a healer. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough. The world is full of quiet heroes, their sacrifices unseen, their skills unappreciated. Look closer. The person stocking a shelf, cleaning a floor, or quietly doing their job might just be a giant in disguise, waiting for their moment to remind us all what true competence and character look like.